The air in the 41st millennium is thick with the dust of 10,000 years of decay. It is a foul miasma of ignorance and fear clinging to the soul of humanity like a burial shroud. In the cavernous naves of continent-sized cathedrals, the voices of 1 billion priests rise in a discordant chorus, chanting litanies to a silent God they do not understand. Their words are rote, meaningless catechisms passed down through generations of darkness, their original meaning lost to the bonfire of history. They speak of righteousness, but their faith is a weapon. They preach of hope, but their tithe is paid in blood and terror. On a nameless world in the Sabbat World sector, a soldier of the Astra Militarum, his lungs burning with chemical smog, sinks into the blood-soaked mud of a trench. His name is forgotten, a single number in a regiment of millions, a disposable cell in the decaying body of the Imperium. His lasgun, a tool of a science he can no longer comprehend, lies broken beside him. In his final moments, he doesn't see the face of the God Emperor, nor does he hear the song of angels. He sees only the cold, indifferent stars, pinpricks in a galaxy that has forgotten what it means to dream. His life is a single extinguished spark in an endless grinding war that has consumed the galaxy for 10 millennia. This is the Imperium of man, a corpse empire rotting from within, held together only by the blind faith of the masses and the iron will of the few. And through it all a light, not a light of hope, but a psychic scream of unimaginable agony. From the heart of holy terror, the Astronomicon cuts through the turbulent tides of the warp, a ghostly beacon for a lost and dying race. It is the Emperor's light, they say. The God Emperor's gaze piercing the darkness to guide his faithful. But it is a cold light, a desperate light powered by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, their souls consumed to fuel a machine that holds the tatters of civilization together. It is a lighthouse built on a foundation of skulls, guiding ships through a storm that will never end. The Imperium is a prison, and its warden is a corpse upon a golden throne. But it was not always so. Rewind the clock. 10,000 years, a lifetime of empires, a mere breath in the lifespan of the stars. Rewind past the age of heresy, past the schism and the betrayal. Rewind to a time when the galaxy was young and humanity's future was a canvas of infinite possibility. It was the dawn of the 30th millennium, the age of the Great Crusade. An era of breathtaking expansion of logic, of an impossible, brilliant hope. The stars, once terrifying and distant, were being reclaimed. Humanity, shattered and broken by the long night of strife, was being reunited. A tide of steel and fire and enlightenment swept across the galaxy, not to conquer in the name of a god, but to liberate in the name of reason. It was an age where humanity looked to the future not with fear, but with the unshakable certainty that it was theirs to master. At the heart of this grand design was one man, not a god, not a deity to be worshipped with blind fanaticism. He was a leader, a scientist, a philosopher, a warrior, a conqueror, the emperor. He did not appear in a flash of divine light surrounded by choirs of angels. He strode from the wastelands of a war-torn terror, a figure of impossible power and intellect, his gaze fixed on the stars. He saw a humanity on its knees, steeped in superstition, ruled by techno-barbarian warlords who squabbled over the ruins of a forgotten golden age. And in them, he saw the potential for greatness. He forged an army not of fanatics, but of soldiers. He built a government not on faith, but on secular truth. He offered humanity not salvation, but ascension. His promise was the imperial truth, a simple, powerful, and radical creed. There are no gods. There are no demons. The supernatural is a lie, a phantasm born of fear and the roiling energies of the warp, a dimension that could be understood, shielded against, and ultimately tamed by science. Humanity needed no saviors from beyond the veil of reality. It would be its own savior. Reason was its sword. Science was its shield. Unity was its armor. This was the vision. A united galaxy, a single human race, masters of science and reason, forever freed from the shackles of otherworldly predators who fed on their faith and fear. An empire of light and logic, where every man and woman could reach their full potential, striding amongst the stars as the rightful inheritors of the cosmos. A golden age forged by human hands. This was the Emperor's original vision. A dream so bright, so audacious, that its failure would cast a shadow that would blacken the galaxy for the next 100 centuries. The central agonizing question echoes from the blood-soaked battlefields of the 41st millennium back to the gleaming promenades of that lost dawn. What was this perfect, rational plan? And how did it curdle into the endless nightmare that is the Imperium of man? Before the dawn, there was only the night. A long, suffocating night that had lasted for 5,000 years. It was an age of regression, of fear, a time history would remember as the Age of Strife. The galaxy, once a bustling network of human worlds, linked by the marvels of technology, had been torn asunder. The Imperium, the strange parallel dimension of psychic energy, boiled over in a storm of unprecedented violence. Warp storms like cosmic hurricanes of madness raged across the void, cutting off star systems, isolating worlds, and snapping the gossamer threads of interstellar communication. Humanity was thrown back into the dark. On Terra itself, the cradle of the species, the fall was hardest. The gleaming spires of the dark age of technology crumbled into dust, their secrets lost to the ravages of time and war. The planet became a patchwork of warring states, a boneyard of forgotten glories ruled by monsters. Techno-barbarian warlords, their bodies grotesquely augmented with scavenged machinery, led armies of gene-forged mutants and desperate soldiers across irradiated wastelands. The tyrant of the Pan-Pacific Dust Conclave drank distilled blood from a golden goblet, while his radiation priests chanted hymns to the angry atom. In the ruins of what was once Merica, Thalem clans waged perpetual war, their warriors clad in the skins of their conquered foes. Knowledge was heresy. Progress was a forgotten word. History was a myth. Humanity was a species eating itself alive in the ruins of its own paradise. Then from the blood-drenched soil of the forgotten continent of Himalasia he came. He was not announced by portents or prophecies. He arrived at the head of an army clad in gold and thunder. They called themselves the Thunder Warriors. They were giants men forged into living weapons, the first terrifying draft of a greater design. They were stronger and larger than any man, their muscles laced with combat stimulants, their minds hardwired for aggression. They were magnificent, brutal and tragically flawed, their bodies unstable, their lifespans short and violent. They were a hammer designed for a single brutal purpose, to shatter the old world and forge a new one. And the man who wielded this hammer was a force unlike any Terra had seen. He was a statesman who could debate the intricacies of post-atomic governance with the wisest of the remaining savants, and a general who could outmaneuver the most cunning of the techno-barbarian lords. He was a scientist who understood the very building blocks of life, and a warrior whose presence on the battlefield was enough to turn the tide. He spoke not of gods or spirits, but of unity of a shared human destiny among the stars. To those who would listen, he offered a place in his new world. To those who refused, he offered only annihilation. The armies of the tyrant Nathan Doom, the self-proclaimed Emperor of the Black Judges, were ground to dust beneath the armored heel of the Thunder Warriors. The insidious Psyker covens of the Indonesic bloc were scoured from their mountain fortresses by gouts of cleansing flame. One by one, the warring states of Terra fell, not just to brute force, but to a strategy so encompassing, so total, that it seemed to border on precognition. An iron hand, guided by a peerless intellect, was closing around the throat of Old Night. Finally, after decades of relentless conflict, the unification wars were over. The last tyrant was slain. The last pocket of resistance was crushed. For the first time in 5 millennia, a single banner flew over all of Terra, the Golden Raptor Imperialis. A fragile peace settled over the ravaged planet. Hope, a long-extinct emotion, began to stir in the hearts of the newly conquered populace. They looked to the golden figure who had united them, the man they now called the Emperor, and saw a savior. They did not see the calculus behind his eyes. The Thunder Warriors, the very soldiers who had won him the world, were a tool whose purpose was now spent. They were too violent, too unstable, their minds too broken by the horrors of the wars they had so eagerly waged. They were relics of the very barbarism the Emperor sought to eradicate. They could not be part of the future. And so, in the shadow of his greatest victory, the Emperor committed his first great betrayal. On the peak of Mount Ararat, the final site of his triumph, as the Thunder Legions celebrated their victory, the order was given. The new elite, the gleaming perfection of the Legio Custodes, turned their spears and power blades upon their former allies. It was not a battle, it was a methodical extermination. The architects of unity were erased from the history they had helped to write, their names struck from all records, their existence relegated to whispers. It was a swift, brutal, and necessary act of political surgery. It was the first purge. And it was a chilling testament to the truth that the Emperor's grand vision for humanity, his golden dream of a rational future, would be built upon a foundation of ruthless pragmatism, cold-blooded murder, and terrible hidden truths. With Terra united, its skies cleared of radioactive dust, and its people yoked to a single grand purpose, the Emperor unveiled the philosophical cornerstone of his new Imperium. It was not a religion. It was its antithesis. It was a declaration of war against the very concept of faith. He called it the imperial truth. Its central tenet was breathtaking in its simplicity and audacity. There were no gods. No benevolent deities watched from on high. No malevolent spirits lurked in the shadows. The universe was a vast, physical, and ultimately knowable place, governed not by caprice or divine will, but by the immutable laws of science and reason. The strange, terrifying phenomena that humanity had for millennia attributed to the supernatural were merely misunderstood aspects of reality. The whispers in the dark, the visions in the flames, the monstrous entities that clawed at the thin veil between dimensions, these were not demons or gods. They were manifestations of the Imperium, the Immaterium, a parallel dimension of raw psychic energy populated by alien intelligences and shaped by the collective consciousness of sentient species. They were dangerous, yes, incredibly so, but they were not divine. They were predators, and like any predator, they could be studied, understood, and ultimately defeated. The imperial truth was a creed of liberation. Its purpose was to free humanity from the chains of superstition that had bound it for millennia. Fear, the Emperor argued, was the true enemy of progress. Fear of the unknown had led to the worship of false gods, the burning of witches, the rejection of science, and the stagnation that had culminated in the horrors of old night. By systematically dismantling the edifice of religion, by proving that mankind was alone in the universe, the master of its own fate, he would unshackle its potential. Humanity would no longer cower in the darkness, praying to non-existent saviors. It would stride into the light, armed with logic, its destiny held firmly in its own hands. This was the promise, a future where every mystery could be solved, every challenge overcome through intellect and empirical evidence. To spread this new gospel of godlessness, a new order of missionaries was created, the Iterators. They were not priests, but orators, historians, philosophers, and scientists. They traveled with the Crusade fleets, often arriving on newly discovered human worlds long before the first soldier set foot on the soil. They were the voice of the Imperium, and their weapon was reason. On worlds where forgotten colonies of humanity had fallen into primitive faith, the Iterators would debate the local priests in public forums, dismantling their arguments with logic, and scientific proof. On planets where civilization had been preserved, they would lecture in grand halls showcasing the technological marvels of the Imperium and offering a future of shared knowledge and progress. They spoke of the Great Crusade not as a war of conquest, but as a great reunification. They offered not subjugation, but partnership in the most magnificent undertaking in human history. Many worlds listened, drawn by the promise of a future free from the dogma and bloodshed that had defined their isolated existence. They willingly chose to be assimilated. The flag of the Imperium was raised on countless planets without a single shot being fired. These were the victories of the imperial truth, the triumphs of enlightenment. But enlightenment can cast a long and terrible shadow. What of the worlds that refused the truth? What of those whose cultures were so deeply intertwined with faith that to abandon their gods was to abandon their very identity? The imperial truth, for all its enlightened philosophy, was not optional. The emperor's vision was absolute, and dissent was not tolerated. When the silver tongue of the iterator failed, the iron fist of the legiones astartes would follow. This was the dark side of the creed, the practice known simply as compliance. It was a brutal, uncompromising process. On the world of Colchis, whose people worshipped a pantheon of benevolent gods, the newly found Word-Bearers Legion, commanded by their Primarch Lorgar, were ordered to tear down their own temples. On worlds where the populace rose up to defend their faith, the Space Marines became angels of death. Cities were leveled by orbital bombardment, their sacred texts burned in pyres that lit the night sky, their priests executed as purveyors of falsehoods. The icons of 1,000 different gods were ground to dust under the treads of predator tanks. The message was unequivocal: you will accept reason, or you will be erased. The imperial truth was not merely an idea, it was a universal mandate, and its scripture was written in bolter shells and blood. The dream of a rational, unified galaxy was being forged in the fires of holy war, an undeclared war against the very idea of God. And in this brutal contradiction lay the seeds of its own damnation. The Emperor's grand strategy required more than just armies of ordinary men, or even the formidable Thunder Warriors. To conquer a galaxy, he needed generals of unparalleled genius, symbols of human perfection, beings who could stand as living embodiments of his vision. He needed sons. And so in the silent, sterile gene laboratories deep beneath the surface of Luna, he embarked upon his most ambitious and ultimately most tragic creation, the Primarch Project. This was the pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic mastery. From the template of his own transcendent DNA, he forged 20 new beings, each one a demigod, a unique expression of human potential. One was the perfect strategist, another the consummate artisan, a third the indomitable warrior, a fourth the peerless statesman. They were designed to be more than just generals. They were to be the shepherds of humanity's future, the architects of the coming golden age. They gestated in advanced nutrient cradles, their minds flooded with knowledge, even as their superhuman bodies grew. They were the Emperor's masterwork, the 20 living tools that would execute his will across the stars. But the nascent powers of the warp, the very forces the Emperor sought to starve into oblivion, would not allow such a plan to come to fruition unchallenged. In a catastrophic psychic event, a vortex of raw Empyrean energy tore through the lunar gene labs. The protective wards shattered. With a scream of triumph that echoed only in the minds of the desperate scientists, the incubator pods containing the infant Primarchs were snatched from reality, spirited away, and scattered across the galaxy, cast upon forgotten and often brutal human worlds to be raised far from the guiding hand of their creator. It was a devastating blow, a wound in the heart of the Emperor's dream before it had even truly begun. For decades, the Emperor prosecuted the Great Crusade, with his Legions Astartes legionaries forged from the genetic templates of his lost sons, but he never stopped searching. The first reunion was a moment of profound galaxy-altering significance. On the noxious, gang-ruled mining world of Chthoniya, a planet shrouded in industrial pollution and ruled by the law of the blade, his quest came to an end. He found Horus. Raised in the brutal hive slums, Horus had risen through the ranks of Chthoniya's violent gangs to become their undisputed master, his innate charisma and tactical genius shining even in the darkest of pits. When the golden figure of the Emperor descended, Horus did not cower. He stood his ground, and in the Emperor's eyes he saw a reflection of his own soul. It was a moment of pure hope, the mending of a wound thought permanent. The Emperor, a being so often distant and calculating, looked upon Horus with something that resembled a father's pride. Horus in turn gave his father his immediate and unwavering loyalty. He was the first found the prodigal son returned, and he would quickly become the brightest star in the firmament of the Great Crusade. This bond, so powerful and promising, would one day become the fulcrum upon which the fate of the galaxy would tragically turn. As the Crusade expanded, more of the lost sons were found. Leman Russ, the Wolf King of the Death World Fenris, Ferrus Manus, the iron-handed Gorgon of Medusa, the noble Sanguinius on the irradiated moon of Baal. Each reunion was a triumph, adding another legendary figure to the Imperium's growing pantheon of heroes. As each Primarch was discovered, he was given command of the Space Marine Legion, forged from his own gene seed. These were moments of transcendent connection. The Astartes of the Lunar Wolves looked upon Horus and saw not just a general, but their genetic father, the source of their strength and courage. The warriors of the Blood Angels knelt before the angelic Sanguinius, their loyalty absolute and unconditional. The Primarchs were the spears of the Emperor, the arrows of his will, and with them at the helm of their legions, the pace of the Great Crusade accelerated to a fever pitch. Yet the relationship between father and sons was complex and fraught with a quiet tragedy. The Emperor was their creator, their commander-in-chief, but he was never truly their father. He saw them as magnificent, essential components of his grand machine, not as children to be nurtured. He gave them galaxies to conquer, but offered little in the way of praise or affection. This emotional void created a deep-seated need in many of the Primarchs, a desperate, unspoken craving for their father's acknowledgement and approval. They vied for his favor, competed for his attention, and measured their worth by the glory they won in his name. This yearning, this fundamental flaw in their creation, would become a vulnerability, a crack in the heart of the Imperium that its enemies would one day exploit with devastating consequences. For all its might, the nascent Imperium was built upon a profound and dangerous vulnerability. The very lifeblood of the Great Crusade, its ability to project power across the vastness of space, depended on a pact with the devil. Every starship that made the perilous journey between systems had to plunge into the madness of the warp. And to navigate that roiling psychic hellscape, they relied on two things: the light of the Astronomicon and the third eye of the Navigators. The Navigators were a peculiar and vital strain of human mutant, their lineage stretching back into the dark age of technology. Through their unique third eye, they could perceive the currents of the Empyrean, allowing them to steer vessels through its treacherous tides with a semblance of safety. They were an entrenched aristocracy organized into powerful houses jealously guarding the secrets of their craft. They were essential, and they knew it. The Emperor tolerated their existence as a necessary evil, a crutch that humanity had to lean upon. But he knew it was a fatal flaw. To rely on the Navigators was to rely on mutation. To travel through the warp was to expose every ship, every soldier, every soul to the insidious influence of the very powers he sought to deny. The Great Crusade was a glorious campaign of liberation, but each journey was a roll of the dice, a gamble that a ship would not be lost to the horrors that swam in the psychic sea, or that its crew would not be driven mad by the whispers that echoed in the void. The Imperium's interstellar empire was a series of islands connected by bridges of pure insanity. The Emperor, whose lifespan had granted him a perspective far beyond that of any mortal, knew this was unsustainable. The Imperial truth was designed to starve the entities of the warp, but as long as humanity was forced to use their front door to travel, the war could never truly be won. He needed another way, a path between the stars that did not cut through the heart of chaos. And from his ancient knowledge, he knew that such a path existed. It was the legacy of a dying race, the Eldari. Long before humanity had first reached for the stars, that ancient and sophisticated civilization had mastered the art of interstellar travel. They had constructed the webway, a vast and intricate network of extra-dimensional tunnels, a labyrinth of stable corridors that existed between real space and the immaterium, shielded from the chaos of both. It was a circulatory system for the galaxy, allowing for instantaneous and perfectly safe transit between any 2 points connected by a gate. The Eldari's empire had crumbled, and much of the webway now lay in ruins, abandoned or overrun by strange entities. But it was still there, a ghost of a perfect road waiting to be reclaimed. This was the key. This was the Emperor's true vision for humanity's future. A galaxy where the warp was irrelevant, where travel was as simple as stepping through a doorway, where the predatory gods of the Imperium would be locked out forever, left to wither and die in their empty realm. This was the ultimate gamble. This was the true reason the Emperor had returned to Terra, leaving the completion of the Great Crusade in the hands of his favored son Horus. While his legions pushed ever outward, the Emperor initiated the most secret and important project in human history. Deep beneath the foundations of the Imperial Palace, thousands of psychers, artisans, and scientists labored in absolute secrecy. They were not building a monument or a fortress. They were building a gate, a human-made entrance into the webway. It was an undertaking of unimaginable complexity, an attempt to replicate a science that was millions of years old, blending psychic power and arcane technology on a scale never before witnessed. The Emperor himself oversaw every aspect, his peerless mind orchestrating the grand design. His plan was to create a new human-controlled section of the webway, connecting all the worlds of the Imperium and rendering the navigators and warp travel obsolete overnight. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the masterstroke that would ensure humanity's ascension and its ultimate victory over the darkness. He was not merely building a new empire, he was building a cage around the gods of chaos, and the bars were made of light and reason. At the heart of the Emperor's secret webway project, within the most secure chamber of the subterranean Sanctum Imperialis, sat its most vital and enigmatic component, the Golden Throne. To the few who even knew of its existence, it appeared as a colossal Baroque life support system, a complex mesh of golden machinery, crystalline conduits, and arcane technology. But its function as a stasis device was merely a secondary feature. Its true purpose was infinitely more profound and dangerous. The throne was not entirely a human invention, nor was it solely the Emperor's creation. It was a relic, a piece of Dark Age technology of immense antiquity and power, discovered by the Emperor in the deserts of Asia during the Unification Wars. It was a machine that predated the Imperium, a nexus of psychic and mechanical engineering, whose original purpose was lost to the mists of time. The Emperor, with his unparalleled knowledge, had recognized its potential. He had not built it, but had repurposed it, augmenting its systems, altering its function, and integrating it into the very bedrock of his palace and his grander plan. It was an ancient slumbering machine, and he was awakening it for a new and terrible purpose. The Golden Throne was the engine of the Webway project. Its primary function was to act as a psychic amplifier and control conduit of unimaginable power. The human-built entrance to the Webway was an unstable bleeding wound in the fabric of reality, a violent tear that sought to collapse back into the chaos from which it was made. The throne was the focusing lens the control station required to master it. It needed a psyker of supreme power to sit upon it to act as the living processor for its arcane systems. This psyker would have to project their consciousness through the throne, using its machinery to carve out a stable tunnel within the webway to shield it from the predators that lurked in the labyrinth, and to hold the gate open against the immense pressure of the Imperium. There was only one being in the galaxy with the psychic might and the iron will to perform such a task, the Emperor himself. This was his final role. Once the gate was fully established and the human section of the webway was complete, he intended to take his seat upon the Golden Throne permanently. He would become the gatekeeper, the eternal guardian of humanity's new road, his mind, the silent, watchful sentinel ensuring its safety. It was a role that would remove him from the day-to-day governance of his own Imperium, an ultimate act of delegation and trust in the sons he had appointed to lead in his stead. But there was a dark prophecy woven into the circuits of the ancient machine, a terrible potential that the Emperor with his near-prescient vision must have understood. The throne was a trap, a cage. While it offered the power to master a godlike technology, it also demanded a terrible price. The energies it channeled were immense, capable of destroying both the body and soul of any lesser being. Even for the Emperor, the risk was astronomical. He must have seen the possible futures, the branching paths of fate that led to his own confinement upon that very machine, not as its master, but as its prisoner. Yet he proceeded. He pushed forward with his great work, his eyes fixed on the glorious prize, willing to gamble his own freedom for the future of his species. Whether this was the ultimate act of selfless sacrifice, or the pinnacle of arrogant belief in his own ability to control any outcome, only he would ever know. The Golden Throne was not just the key to humanity's salvation. It was the anvil upon which the Emperor's own tragic destiny would be forged. As the Great Crusade pushed ever deeper into the galactic fringe, a philosophical cancer was growing within its heart. The use of psychic power, the very existence of psykers within the Legiones Astartes, had become a point of fierce contention. To settle the matter once and for all, the Emperor convened a grand council on the tranquil world of Nicaea. It was a gathering of demigods with Primarch's Legion Masters and the highest echelons of the Imperium in attendance, all assembled to debate the fate of the soul of the Crusade. The debate quickly became a fiery confrontation, a clash of ideologies personified by the Emperor's own sons. At the center of one side stood Magnus the Red, the Cyclopean Primarch of the Thousand Suns, his skin the color of rust, his intellect vast beyond measure. Magnus argued passionately for the embrace of psychic power. To him, it was not sorcery or witchcraft. It was a science, another facet of the natural universe to be studied, codified, and mastered. He spoke of the Librarius, the core of battle psychers within the legions, as an essential tool. How could they fight the horrors of the galaxy if they willingly blinded themselves to one of its fundamental forces? To deny the power of the mind, he argued, was to champion ignorance, the very thing the imperial truth was meant to destroy. Opposing him with visceral hatred was Mortarion, the gaunt and grim master of the Death Guard. Raised on the toxic psyker tyrant-ruled world of barbarous Mortarion, saw no difference between the controlled powers of a librarian and the debased sorcery of the warlords he had overthrown. To him, all psychic power was a corrupting influence, a backdoor to the warp that would inevitably lead to damnation. He spoke of its use as a weakness, a cheat that bypassed the true strength of a warrior. He was supported by the feral Leman Russ, the Wolf King, who with gruff simplicity declared such powers to be untrustworthy and dishonorable, a stain on the purity of a warrior's spirit. The chamber became a storm of accusation and ideology, brother against brother, their deeply held convictions clashing in the Emperor's silent, watchful presence. Finally, the Emperor rose. A hush fell upon the great amphitheater. All eyes turned to him, the master of mankind, the most powerful psyker in existence. Magnus felt a surge of confidence. Surely his father, who had used his own psychic might to unite terror, and forge an empire would see the logic in his arguments. He would call for regulation, for study, for control, but not for outright prohibition. The emperor's gaze swept across the assembled demigods, cold and unreadable. And then he gave his judgment. It was not a compromise. It was a death sentence for Magnus's beliefs. He decreed that the use of psychic powers within the Legends Astartes was to be forbidden. The Librarius project was to be dismantled. He spoke of the dangers of the Imperium, of the temptations that lay within its tides, and declared that mankind was not yet ready for such knowledge. He censured Magnus publicly, his words like psychic blows, shaming his son for his pursuit of forbidden lore. The Edict of Nicaea was absolute. Magnus was crushed. It was not the logic of the decision that broke him, but the sheer breathtaking hypocrisy. His own father, a being of unimaginable psychic power, was forbidding his sons from using a fraction of the same gift. He was being punished for seeking knowledge, the very goal his father had always championed. He did not rage. He simply broke his loyalty, fractured by a wound of profound betrayal. The consequences of this judgment rippled out through the Imperium, silent and catastrophic. The Emperor, in his attempt to enforce a simplified dogmatic version of the imperial truth, had made a monumental strategic error. He had not only alienated one of his most powerful and loyal sons, pushing him and his entire legion into a state of isolated disgrace, but he had also willingly disarmed the Imperium. By disbanding the Librarius, he had put out the eyes and ears of his legions, robbing them of their most effective weapon against the subtle manipulations of the warp. The seers who could have warned of demonic possession, the battle psychers who could have shielded their brothers from psychic assault, all were ordered to stand down. Driven by the need to maintain a public lie that there were no gods or demons to fear, the Emperor had rendered his armies vulnerable to the very threat he knew was real. The Council of Nicaea was meant to ensure unity. Instead, it guaranteed division and left the Imperium blind on the eve of the greatest war in its history. To understand the downfall of the Emperor's dream, one must look beyond the external threats and the betrayals of his sons. One must look to the architect himself, for the Emperor of mankind was a being of profound, irreconcilable contradictions. His grand vision, so pure and logical on its surface, was riddled with the very flaws he sought to expunge from the human condition. The most glaring of these contradictions was laid bare at Nicaea. He, a psyker of such immense power that he could hold the consciousness of a species in his mind, forbade the use of psychic abilities. This was not merely a precautionary measure, it was an act of staggering hypocrisy. While he publicly decreed that the path of the psyker was too dangerous for his Astartes, he privately built his Imperium upon a bedrock of psychic power. The silent telepathic communication of his own custodian guard, the astropaths, who bound his empire together with thoughts sent across the void. The navigators he reluctantly tolerated, all were sanctioned exceptions to a rule he brutally enforced upon his sons. He demanded a secular galaxy while wielding a power that bordered on the divine preaching of a truth that he himself did not fully practice. This disconnect extended to his role as a father. He had created 20 sons, beings of immense power and intellect, yet he failed to understand their most fundamental needs. He viewed the Primarchs as he viewed his legions and his fleets, as magnificent, unparalleled tools designed for a specific purpose. He gave them commands, not guidance. He measured their performance, not their well-being. He saw the rage of Angron, a mind shattered by the butcher's nails, and instead of attempting to heal his broken son, he pointed him at the enemy like a living weapon. He saw the desperate need for faith in Lorgar and answered it with cold censure and the annihilation of his works. He placed the weight of the entire galaxy on Horus's shoulders and then retreated into his secrets, offering his most beloved son no comfort, no counsel, only the crushing burden of command. He forged 20 hearts that yearned for a father's love, and then offered them only the cold calculus of a general. This emotional austerity created wounds, insecurity, resentment, jealousy, and pride. that would fester in the darkness, waiting for a whisper of poison to turn them septic. But the greatest and most dangerous contradiction was the one that lay at the very foundation of his Imperium. The imperial truth itself was a calculated lie. The Emperor's declaration that there were no gods was not born of ignorance. He knew with more certainty than any being in existence that the great powers of the warp were real. He had walked in their shadow realms, battled their demonic legions, and understood their nature as vast, sentient, psychic constructs, fed and shaped by the emotions of mortals. He did not deny their existence because he believed they were false. He denied them because he was waging a war of starvation. His grand, audacious gamble was that if he could unite all of humanity under a banner of atheistic reason, he could sever the flow of worship, fear, and faith that gave the Chaos Gods their power. He believed he could kill the gods by convincing his entire species that they did not exist. It was a strategy built on a colossal, galaxy-wide deception, a truth constructed from a fundamental falsehood. This was the Emperor's ultimate paradox in his quest to free humanity from the lie of superstition. He had armed them with a lie of his own. And it was a lie that would leave them utterly unprepared for the truth when it finally came for them in fire and blood. Of all the Emperor's sons, none craved meaning more than Lorga Aurelian. While his brothers were conquerors, strategists, and warriors, Lorga was a seeker, a priest at heart. When the Emperor found him on the world of Colchis, he was already a pious man, a preacher who had overthrown the corrupt ecclesiarchy of his home world. When he learned of his father, the shining golden being from the stars, Lorga did not see a mere man. He saw divinity incarnate. He believed the imperial truth was a test of faith, a humble guise for a god who did not yet wish to be worshipped. And so his legion, the word-bearers, became the most zealous of all. They did not just conquer worlds, they converted them, building monuments and preaching of the god Emperor. Their greatest creation was the city of Monarchia on the world of Kur. Monarchia was known as the perfect city. It was a breathtaking testament to devotion, a city-sized cathedral built to the glory of the Emperor. Every street was aligned to catch the morning sun in a display of celestial reverence. Its spires were crafted from polished obsidian and silver, reaching towards the heavens like praying hands. Grand cathedrals, their interiors adorned with mosaics of gold and marble depicting the Emperor's triumphs, resonated with the sound of 1,000,000 voices singing hymns of praise. To Lorga, Monarchia was the physical manifestation of his love and loyalty, the ultimate offering to the Father he worshipped as a living God. It was the purest expression of the word-bearer's purpose, and they believed with all their hearts that the Emperor would be pleased. He was not. When news of Monarchia reached Terra, the Emperor was filled with a cold rage. This was not loyalty, it was heresy. It was a direct violation of the imperial truth, the very foundation of his vision. Lorga was not spreading enlightenment. He was planting the seeds of the same superstition he had fought to destroy. The punishment was to be as absolute as the crime. Without warning the Thretund Legion, the Ultramarines descended upon Kur. They did not come as brothers but as executioners. Warships of cobalt blue blotted out the sun over Monarchia. Lorga watched in stunned disbelief as their weapons opened fire. The beautiful spires crumbled into dust. The grand cathedrals were shattered by orbital lances. The hymns of praise were replaced by the screams of the dying. The destruction was methodical, merciless, and total. When the last stone had fallen and Monarchia was nothing more than a smoking ruin, the Emperor himself teleported to the surface. He stood amidst the ashes, his golden armor radiating a terrible light. He commanded Lorgar and the entire 16th Legion to kneel before him in the grey dust of their life's work. As the Ultramarines stood guard a perimeter of silent blue judges, the Emperor delivered his judgment. His voice, amplified for all to hear, was not the voice of a disappointed father, but of an angered master reprimanding a disobedient tool. He shamed Lorga, denouncing his faith as a weakness, his worship as a folly that spat in the face of reason. He declared that the word-bearers had failed the Imperium, and their greatest achievement was nothing but a monument to their own ignorance. The humiliation was absolute. Lorgar's spirit, once the brightest flame of faith in the Imperium, was extinguished. He knelt in the ashes for a month, silent and broken, his father's words echoing in his shattered soul. His entire existence had been a lie. The god he worshipped had rejected him and cast him down. When he finally rose, he was a different man. The void left by his broken faith was a gaping wound, and it began to fester. If the Emperor was not a god, then what was? If his truth was so cold and empty, then surely other more worthy truths must exist in the universe. His most trusted advisors, the chaplain Erebus and his adoptive father Cor Firon, secret practitioners of an older, darker faith, saw their moment. They whispered to their broken Primarch of other powers of ancient gods who did not shun belief, but thrived on it, who would welcome his devotion and grant him the truth he so desperately sought. Humiliated, lost, and yearning for a purpose, Lorgar listened. He set his legion upon a new path, a secret pilgrimage into the darkest corners of the galaxy, a search for gods worthy of his faith. Lorgar Aurelian, the Emperor's most devout son, had just become the first to willingly walk the path to damnation. The first domino had fallen. No Primarch shone brighter than Horus Lupercal. He was the first found the Emperor's most beloved son, a being of unmatched charisma, strategic brilliance, and martial prowess. When the Emperor returned to Terra to begin his secret work, he bestowed upon Horus the highest honor imaginable, the title of War Master. With this title came absolute command over all the military forces of the Great Crusade. The Emperor trusted Horus, implicitly placing the fate of his grandest ambition in his son's hands. But the mantle of command was a crushing weight. The entirety of the Great Crusade, a sprawling war front spanning 1,000,000 worlds, now rested upon his shoulders alone. The pressure was immense. Every victory was expected. Every setback was his failure. He was no longer just a commander, but a diplomat, a governor, a judge for 1,000 nascent disputes between his brother Primarchs. The fatigue began to set in a weariness of the soul that no amount of superhuman resilience could completely fend off. A subtle resentment also began to take root. His father had left, retreating into a shroud of secrecy on Terra, without full explanation, leaving Horus to carry the burden. The camaraderie they had once shared on the battlefield was gone, replaced by infrequent astropathic messages that were more like directives than conversations. For the first time, Horus, the favored son, felt less like a partner in a grand design and more like its chief functionary. The seeds of pride, once his greatest strength, began to curdle into a dangerous arrogance, a belief that he and he alone truly understood the toil and sacrifice of the Crusade. The trap was laid on the swampy, disease-ridden moon of the planet Davin. During a campaign to bring the system into compliance, Horus was struck down in combat not by a clean blade or an energy blast, but by a foul weapon of archaic and demonic design called the anathema. The wound it inflicted was more than just physical, it was a spiritual poison. As Horus fell into a death-like coma, the warrior lodge priests of a local cult, secret worshippers of chaos, manipulated by Lorgar's agent, the chaplain Erebus, offered to heal him with their ancient rites. It was a lie. As his body lay helpless, his mind was cast adrift on the tides of the warp, and it was there that the gods of chaos came for him. They did not appear as slavering monsters, but as architects of truth, guided by the whispering spectre of Erebus. They pulled him through a nightmarish vision of the future, a future built upon the lies they had carefully crafted from his deepest fears. They showed him a 41st millennium, not as it would be, but as he would dread it to become an Imperium, where the Emperor was worshipped as a god, his statues adorning every city, his name on the lips of every fanatic. But in this future, the Primarchs were nowhere to be seen. They showed him visions of his brothers being cast aside, their legions purged or forgotten once their usefulness had passed, just like the Thunder Warriors before them. They twisted his father's secrecy into a selfish plot to achieve godhood, a plan that would end with the disposal of his loyal, inconvenient sons. Horus, weakened, isolated, and poisoned by doubt, watched this grand deception unfold. He saw a future where his sacrifices and the sacrifices of his brothers were meaningless, a mere footnote in the ascension of a tyrannical father. His pride, his love for his brothers, his weariness, all were expertly manipulated. The Chaos Gods offered him a choice. He could let this dreadful future come to pass, or he could seize control. He could rebel not for personal power, they whispered, but to save the galaxy from the religious dictatorship his father was secretly planning. He would be the true savior, the one who would liberate humanity from the coming tyranny. Fueled by a potent cocktail of manipulated truth, outright lies, and his own wounded pride, Horus Lupercal made his choice. He accepted the power they offered. He embraced the heresy. When he awoke from his coma, the wound was healed, but his soul was irrevocably tainted. The War Master of the Imperium now served a new set of masters, and his first act would be to turn the glorious machinery of the Great Crusade against the father who had built it. The Horus heresy had begun. On the world of Prospero, a planet of tranquil scholars and crystalline cities, Magnus the Red gazed into the future and saw only fire. Through the esoteric arts he had sworn never to practice again, he had seen the truth of Horus's corruption. He saw the pact made in the shadows of Davin, the legions being marshaled for civil war, and the galaxy-spanning betrayal that was about to unfold. Horror and panic seized him. He, the censured, the shamed, was the only one who knew the full extent of the coming storm. He had to warn his father, but how astropathic messages were too slow, too easily intercepted and twisted by the nascent powers of the War Master. To travel to Terra in person would take months, by which time it would be far too late. There was only one way: a direct psychic message, a soul-to-soul cry for help across the void. It was an act of extreme sorcery, a flagrant and desperate violation of the Edict of Nicaea. He knew the risks. He knew his father's wrath would be terrible. But the alternative to stand by and watch the Imperium burn was unthinkable. His loyalty to his father, though fractured, outweighed his fear of punishment. Gathering his most powerful sorcerers within the Great Pyramid of Photep, Magnus began a ritual of immense power, drawing upon forbidden knowledge and channeling vast reserves of psychic energy. He would tear a hole through the fabric of reality itself to deliver his warning, a desperate gamble to save the father who had turned his back on him. The psychic message Magnus unleashed was not a subtle whisper. It was a battering ram of pure, focused energy. It screamed across the galaxy in an instant, a psychic meteor aimed at the very heart of the Imperium. It bypassed all conventional wards and protocols, for its target was the mind of the Emperor himself, deep within his secret laboratory beneath the Himalayas. But the Emperor's Sanctum Imperialis was protected by more than just stone and steel. It was shielded by a complex and delicate lattice of psychic wards, a multi-layered defense woven from the Emperor's own mind to protect his most vital work, the webway gate from the prying eyes of the warp. Magnus's desperate sorcerous message, amplified by forbidden powers, struck these wards with the force of an artillery shell. The psychic shield shattered. The delicate, intricate web of protection, the most complex psychic construct ever created by the Emperor, was torn asunder. For a brief, catastrophic moment, a raw, unfiltered breach was opened, not just into the sanctum, but into the fragile, human-built extension of the webway itself. The Emperor received his son's message, a jumble of terrifying images and a single desperate name: Horus. But the warning was delivered at an unthinkable cost. The breach was a gaping wound, and through it poured the undiluted madness of the immaterium. The consequences were instantaneous and apocalyptic. The pristine, stable corridors of the human webway, the Emperor's secret path to a rational future, were instantly flooded with the stuff of nightmares. Legions of demons, the gibbering, multi-hued horrors of the chaos god Tzeentch, the very entity Magnus had unknowingly consorted with to power his ritual, poured through the rupture. A secret war erupted in the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace. The elite Legio Custodes, the Emperor's Golden Praetorians, and the eerie soul-dead warriors of the Sisters of Silence were thrown into a desperate, hopeless battle. They fought against an infinite tide of madness, their spears and blades clashing with claws and teeth forged from pure psychic energy. This was not a war they could win. For every daemon they struck down, 10 more clawed their way through the breach. The Emperor's great work was ruined. His secret path to humanity's salvation had become a back door for its damnation. With his dream collapsing around him, the Emperor was forced to make a terrible choice. He abandoned his workbenches and genetic laboratories and ascended the steps to the Golden Throne. But he did not sit upon it as a proud artisan ready to activate his masterpiece. He sat upon it as a desperate soldier, a psychic dam his mind, the only thing powerful enough to hold back the demonic flood and prevent it from consuming Terra itself. The Horus Heresy had not yet fired its first public shot, but the Emperor's original vision, his golden dream of a future free from the warp, was already dead. It had been slain not by an enemy, but by the tragic, well-intentioned blunder of a loyal son. The Horus Heresy did not begin with a declaration of war, but with a quiet order cloaked in the language of duty. The world of Istvan III, a densely populated hive world, had declared its independence under its governor, a man Horus, branded as an apostate and a traitor. To bring the system back into compliance, the War Master commanded a massive invasion force. At the tip of the spear were 4 full legions, the brutal World Eaters, the flamboyant Emperor's children, the grimly resilient Death Guard, and the War Master's own sons of Horus. The first wave of Astartes, composed of companies whose loyalty was secretly deemed suspect by their primarchs, would make the initial assault. It was a trap of breathtaking cynicism. Tens of thousands of Space Marines descended upon the Coral City, the planet's capital. The loyalist warriors, men like Captain Garviel Loken of the Sons of Horus, fought with righteous fury, believing they were crushing a rebellion to uphold the Emperor's name. They plunged into the thick of the fighting, their bolters roaring, their chain swords singing a hymn of war. They were the Emperor's finest, purging a world of its treachery, and they expected their brothers in orbit to support them. As the battle reached its zenith, the Loyalists prepared for the second wave for the arrival of their primarchs Angron Fulgrim Mortarion and Horus himself. They looked to the sky for salvation. They received only damnation. From the fleet in high orbit, the order was given. The orbital batteries spoke not with the clean fury of macro cannon shells, but with the whispered doom of life-eater warheads. The sky turned a sickly phosphorescent green as the canisters rained down, unleashing a virus of terrifying potency. It was a biophage that consumed all organic matter, spreading across the planet in a tidal wave of decomposition. Billions of civilians died in seconds, their bodies dissolving into a black, bubbling sludge. The very air was rendered into a flammable, poisonous gas. The Loyalist Astartes, their sealed power armor offering only a few moments of protection, watched in horror as the world died around them. Then came the second phase. The orbital batteries fired again, igniting the gas-choked atmosphere. A global firestorm erupted, a hurricane of flame that scoured the planet's surface, turning continents to glass and oceans to ash. The betrayal was absolute. Horus had not come to purge a rebellious world. He had come to purge his own legions of their loyalty to Terra. Yet even in this manufactured hell, some survived. Shielded in the depths of subterranean bunkers, or by the sheer indomitable will of their transhuman physiology, a handful of Astartes endured the Holocaust. Garviel Loken, his faith shattered his heart. A cold knot of grief rose from the ashes alongside his Mournival brothers. On another part of the battlefield, Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, a warrior of unshakable conviction, rallied the remnants of his company. They emerged onto a surface of black glass and poisoned smoke, a graveyard world haunted by the ghosts of their dead brothers. And they were not alone. From drop pods that screamed through the burning sky, their former comrades, the traitors who had knowingly followed their Primarchs into damnation, descended to finish the job. The great betrayal was now a grim and intimate reality. Brother fought brother in the ruins of a murdered world. Amidst the carnage, Garrow made a desperate choice. He saw his loyalist brothers, men like Saul Tarvitz, preparing to make a final hopeless stand. But Garrow knew that dying here served no purpose. The truth had to be told. The Imperium had to be warned. Fighting his way through the traitor lines, he and a small band of survivors managed to seize a single frigate, the Eisenstein, and punch a hole through the traitor blockade. Wounded and pursued, he set a desperate course for the one place that mattered terror. He was a lone voice carrying the tale of a nightmare too vast to comprehend a herald of the coming darkness. The news of Istvan III, carried by the battered frigate Eisenstein, was a seismic shock that fractured the Imperium to its core. The galaxy, once united under the single purpose of the Great Crusade, was now forced to choose. There was no middle ground, no room for neutrality. The War Master was a traitor. Brother was turned against brother, not just in the ranks of the Astartes, but on every world and in every fleet. Systems that had known peace for centuries erupted into vicious civil wars, their skies once again filled with the fire of planetary bombardment. The grand tapestry of reunification was being unraveled thread by bloody thread. The most profound casualty was the imperial truth. The Emperor's creed of logic and reason died almost overnight, consumed by the fires of war and the terror of betrayal. In its place, two new opposing faiths rose from the ashes. On worlds loyal to terror, the worship of the Emperor as a protective deity, the very heresy Lorgar had been punished for exploded into a fervent mainstream religion. The people, terrified and desperate, needed a god to pray to, and they found one in their distant, silent master. On the worlds that sided with Horus, the clandestine chaos cults that had festered in the shadows for decades burst into the open. They preached of freedom from the tyranny of terror, of embracing the powers of the warp, and of ascension through the patronage of new, more generous gods. The galaxy was no longer a realm of enforced atheism. It was a battleground of warring religions, a grim mirror of the very past the Emperor had sought to escape. Horus moved quickly to capitalize on the chaos. His next target was the Istvan system's fifth planet. This time, the Loyalists were coming for him. 3 full legions, the Iron Hands of Ferrus Manus, the Raven Guard of Corvus Corax, and the Salamanders of Vulcan arrived to bring the War Master to justice. They were the vanguard of a larger Loyalist force, a righteous hammer blow meant to crush the rebellion before it could truly begin. It was another trap, one of even more monstrous scale than the first. The first wave of Loyalists landed in the drop zone, a blasted wasteland designated Urgal Depression, and were immediately met by the full force of the traitors already on the surface. The battle was a maelstrom of armor and fury, but the Loyalists held their own, their resolve hardened by righteous anger. They awaited their reinforcements, a second wave of 4 more legions arriving to support them. The reinforcements came. The drop pods of the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Wordbearers, and Alpha Legion rained from the sky. But as their doors hissed open, their guns did not turn on Horus's forces. They turned on the embattled Loyalists. The betrayal was complete. 7 legions, a full third of the Emperor's holy host, had turned against him. The drop site massacre had begun. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Trapped in a killing field, encircled and vastly outnumbered, the Loyalist legions were systematically annihilated. Ferrus Manus, in a fury, fought his way through the battle, to confront his once closest brother Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, and was beheaded for his efforts. The dream of brotherhood died with him. The Imperium's back was broken in the black sands of Istvan Fiv, and as his fleets burned and his sons died, the Emperor was silent, not by choice but by necessity. Horus, empowered by the Chaos Gods, had orchestrated a final devastating blow. Chanting dark rituals, the Word-Bearers summoned a warp storm of unprecedented size and fury, a roiling tempest of psychic energy that would be known as the Ruin Storm. It ripped across the galaxy a celestial hurricane that rendered interstellar travel and communication impossible. The light of the Astronomicon, the Emperor's guiding beacon, was snuffed out, lost behind an impenetrable veil of madness. The galaxy was effectively torn in two. Terra was isolated. The Imperium was blinded, its central nervous system severed. The dream of a united human race, connected by reason and purpose, had become a nightmare of 1,000 isolated wars fought in the darkness under a silent, empty sky. After years of bloodshed that had set the galaxy aflame, the war came home. The fleet of the War Master, a vast armada of corrupted warships and demonic vessels, breached the Sol System's final defenses. The sky over Terra, the cradle of humanity, bled rust and poison. Orbital defense platforms that had stood silent for centuries were shattered into incandescent rain. And then they landed. Legions of traitor Astartes, twisted and warped by the powers they now served, stormed the throne world alongside hordes of gibbering demons and millions of screaming cultists. The siege of Terra had begun. The battle was not for a planet, it was for the soul of the species. The fighting was a vision of hell made manifest. It was a war on a scale so vast it defied comprehension. At the Lion's Gate, the war titans of the Legio Mortis, their hulls encrusted with symbols of decay, traded cataclysmic volleys with the loyal god machines of the Legio Ignatum. The ground shook with the footfalls of giants. In the sprawling spaceports, the World Eaters, led by their demonic Primarch Angron, carved a path of mindless slaughter through the desperate ranks of the Imperial army. Every inch of the Imperial Palace, a fortress continent designed by the Primarch Rogel Dawn himself, became a blood-soaked battlefield. The outer walls fell then, the inner precincts. The traitors pushed ever onward, a tide of hatred and madness, breaking against the final bastion, the Eternity Gate. At the heart of the defense were the last demigods of Terra. Rogel Dawn the Praetorian was an unflinching bulwark of stone and duty, his strategic genius the only thing holding the defense together against impossible odds. He was everywhere at once, his voice, a steady rock in the storm of chaos, directing the flow of battle with grim resolve. And before the Eternity Gate stood Sanguinius, the great angel Primarch of the Blood Angels. He was a beacon of impossible grace in the midst of utter depravity, his white wings a stark contrast to the blood and grime of the siege. He was hope personified, single-handedly holding back hordes of the damned, his every blow a work of art, his presence a defiant roar against the dying of the light. Alongside them fought the Custodes, the Imperial Fists, and the remnants of 100 loyalist regiments. Billions of ordinary soldiers armed with little more than laser guns and courage laid down their lives to defend a dream they had never been allowed to fully understand. Their sacrifice, a testament to the indomitable, hopeless spirit of humanity. For weeks the battle raged. The palace was in ruins, the defenders bled white, but they did not break. Horus, from his command throne aboard his flagship, the vengeful spirit watched with growing impatience. His victory was assured, but time was no longer on his side. A loyalist relief fleet led by the Ultramarines was breaking through the ruin storm. He could win the siege, but lose the war. Swollen with the power of chaos, his mind a vortex of arrogance and paranoia, he made a final desperate gambit. In an act of supreme defiance and hubris, he ordered the void shields of the vengeful spirit to be lowered. It was not a tactical move, it was a personal invitation. a challenge broadcast across all channels to his father. The path to the arch-traitor was now in open. He was daring the Emperor to face him, to end it all one way or another, in a final confrontation between father and son. The Emperor accepted the challenge. In a blinding flash of golden light, he teleported aboard the vengeful spirit, accompanied by Sanguinius Rogel Dawn and a retinue of his finest custodian guard. But the corrupted energies of the vessel twisted the teleportation. They were scattered. Sanguinius the angel materialized alone directly in the throne room of the arch-traitor. Before him stood Horus, no longer the noble brother he had once known, but a monstrous parody, his form swollen with the blasphemous power of chaos, his armor fused to his flesh. Horus offered his brother a final chance to join him. Sanguinius, the epitome of loyalty, refused. The battle that followed was brief and brutal. The angel fought with all his divine fury, but he was no match for a being who was a conduit for 4 malevolent gods. Horus broke the angel's body, shattered his white wings, and in a final act of cruel mockery, extinguished the brightest light in the Imperium. But in his sacrifice, Sanguinius's pure spirit struck a blow Horus could not comprehend, creating a tiny, imperceptible crack in the War Master's psychic armor. When the Emperor finally reached the throne room, he found the broken body of his most beloved son lying at the feet of the monster he had once called Horus. A cold, silent agony, deeper than any physical wound, gripped the master of mankind. The battle for the fate of humanity began. But the Emperor held back. Even as Horus struck at him with the full, untamed power of the warp, the Emperor parried his blows aimed to disable, not to kill. He was fighting not just a monster, but the memory of the son he had loved, the brilliant general he had raised to the stars. In the swirling madness of Horus's eyes, he searched desperately for a flicker of the man he once was. This hesitation, this father's grief, was a fatal weakness. Horus, feeling no such restraint, struck a series of devastating blows, crushing the Emperor's body, tearing through his golden armor and leaving him mortally wounded upon the floor of the ravaged bridge. Horus stood over his fallen father, a triumphant god of ruin. At that moment, a lone custodian Alanius person charged forward to defend his master. Horus sneered, and with a contemptuous flick of his power claw, obliterated the loyal warrior from existence. And in that single callous act, the Emperor finally saw the truth. The son he had loved was truly gone, consumed entirely by the howling darkness. All that remained was a puppet of chaos. The internal conflict ceased, replaced by a terrible cold certainty. With the last dregs of his strength, the Emperor gathered his full psychic might. It was not a physical blow, but a focused lance of pure soul fire, a psychic scream of absolute annihilation. It bypassed Horus's physical form and struck the crack in his soul that Sanguinius's sacrifice had created. It hit the arch-traitor's very essence, scouring him not just from life, but from existence itself, erasing his soul from the fabric of reality. The victory was absolute, and the cost was everything. Rogel Dawn was the one who found them. He entered the throne room to see the vaporized remains of Horus and the shattered, dying body of his father. The Emperor was broken beyond any hope of recovery, his life sustained only by the barest flicker of his own immense will. With his last whispered words, he gave his final commands to his stoic, grief-stricken son. Don his face an unmoving mask of stone, hiding a shattered heart tenderly lifted the ruined form of the master of mankind. He carried his father away from the scene of his Pyrrhic victory, back through the carnage of the palace to the one place he could be saved, and yet forever imprisoned the arcane machinery of the Golden Throne. Rogel Dawn carried the broken body of his father through the ruins of a dream. The battle for Terra was over. The traitor fleet was in disarray, their god-king slain. But there was no triumph, no celebration. Only the hollow echo of a victory that had cost humanity its soul. He brought the Emperor to the deep, secret chambers of the Sanctum Imperialis, to the foot of the Golden Throne. The great machine, once intended to be the key to humanity's glorious ascension, was now its last desperate hope for survival. In an agonizing procedure of arcane techno-necromancy, the last of the Emperor's loyal tech priests and artisans connected his shattered form to the throne's intricate systems. It was not a throne of command, but a coffin of gilded life support, a cage of unimaginable complexity designed to sustain the faintest flicker of life in the master of mankind's ravaged body. The Emperor of mankind, the conqueror of stars and champion of reason, was silent. In that silence, a new faith was born. As the news of the Emperor's sacrifice and internment spread, the people of Terra and beyond, traumatized by the horrors of the heresy, needed something to cling to. They saw not a failed strategist or a wounded man, but a martyr who had given his life to save them from the ultimate darkness. The seeds of worship that Lorgar had sown and been punished for now bloomed into a forest of uncontrolled fanaticism. A new religion, the ecclesiarchy, rose from the ashes, preaching the divinity of the God Emperor of mankind. His imperial truth was cast aside, branded as a relic of a simpler time. His name became a holy word, his image an icon to be venerated. The Imperium was reborn not as a secular empire of science, but as a theocracy built on the worship of the one man who had declared that no gods existed. The Emperor's original vision was not just dead, it was grotesquely inverted. His dream of a galaxy united by logic was replaced by an empire held together by blind faith and brutal intolerance. The iterators who had once spread enlightenment were replaced by confessors who preached dogma and burned heretics. His ambition to free humanity from the shackles of fear created the greatest prison the galaxy had ever known, a stagnant, paranoid Imperium where free thought was a crime, innovation was heresy, and the Inquisition hunted any who deviated from the iron-clad orthodoxy. He had sought to create a future of progress, but instead bequeathed an age of unending decay, where the technologies of the past were worshipped as magical relics, their true function no longer understood. And in the greatest and most tragic irony of all the Emperor's ultimate gambit, his plan to starve the Chaos Gods into oblivion had failed in the most spectacular way imaginable. The Imperium of Man, the very instrument he had created to achieve this goal, now became their single greatest source of sustenance. The endless grinding wars fought in his name generated an ocean of pain and hatred on which the blood god Khorne could feast. The stagnant, decaying bureaucracy and the plagues that swept through overcrowded hive worlds nourished the god of disease Nurgle. The intricate plots of nobles and inquisitors fed the ever-scheming Tzientch. The rigid dogma and the secret cults of pleasure and excess gave power to Slaanesh. His Imperium, in its desperate eternal struggle, was a perpetual motion machine of soul food for the very entities he had sought to destroy. He sits there still 10,000 years later, a mummified corpse upon a throne of cold gold. He is not a benevolent god watching over his people. He is a prisoner, his mind a silent psychic scream of agony, trapped within a decaying body, forced to witness the perversion of his every ideal. The light of the Astronomicon is not a guiding gaze of a loving father. It is the raging, desperate psychic power of a captive, his soul consumed to fuel the very superstition he gave his life to eradicate. The golden dream of a rational future is dead, and buried, its memory erased by a millennium of lies. From its ashes rose the age of the Imperium. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. There is only the laughter of thirsting gods, and there is only the silent, eternal tragedy of a failed vision, a ghastly, unending echo of a dream that once promised the stars.